Hello everyone. So I am going to talk today about the impact of trauma and difference, thinking specifically around conscious and unconscious interactions. So my research is looking at the relationship between two therapists when they work with ethnically marginalised families, and also considering if a history of trauma within the family is significant in their relationship. So before I start, it might be helpful to think about what is child and adolescent psychoanalytic psychotherapy, as that's a framework for my talk today and also my research. So in child and adolescent psychoanalytic psychotherapy, we are working with the individual to think about their internal world, as well as their emotional development and their unconscious and conscious communications. So when I'm thinking about the internal world, I'm referring to what's happening inside emotionally and mentally. And when I'm thinking about unconscious communications, I work in CAMS, we see lots of families and young people where they would have been referred for a specific issue or symptom. We are interested in that, but we're also curious about what are the drivers for those symptoms, what's happening underneath the surface. So thinking about the families that we work with who may have a history of migration, displacement or colonialism, and thinking about trauma that is travelled through generations and passed through the family, Paul's quote here speaks to trauma being held in the body. So the removal of threat alone does not make a nervous system feel safe. It needs the addition of safe, social engagement and bonding. So really what we're thinking about here is trauma that's held in the body that doesn't disappear once someone has been removed or has left that traumatic or environment. So really these are the two questions that I'm thinking about, which is how does these experiences show up in your interactions as the individual with your friends, family members, your therapists or other professionals, your teachers or schools or other institutions, and also how does difference such as race, gender, class, disability or sexuality inform these experiences. So if we think about how trauma can disrupt the identity, we can think about the identity before the traumatic event, the identity at the point of disaster, at the point of rescue, of alienation, asylum seeking and after. So I have a snapshot of some of my findings here. So this is one of my findings, which is the theme, the impact of trauma. It's one of my themes. So I have some quotes here that I've taken from the participants where they're describing what the impact of trauma has had on them. So these are therapists. And I was really curious about what was the emotional and somatic impacts of what was happening in the body for these therapists when they were working with these families who may not have been referred for a current trauma. So the first one, the therapist is talking about their impression of the family when they met them, that they both felt like they had the world on their shoulders a bit. The second quote, the therapist is recalling a moment where they would go back to the clinic after seeing this family and being an absolute flood of tears, that it was just so incredibly painful and frightening. In the third quote, the therapist is talking about really how palpable the trauma was in the family and that everyone could feel it, that they really felt overwhelmed by the sadness. And she's talking about the network here, so other professionals that were involved. And then the fourth one, the therapist was talking about her work with the parent, that it was really overwhelming, that it was a lot of work, it felt endless. And then the last quote, the therapist is referring to themselves, that they would feel really emotional and really guilty. And so as I was sort of thinking about what was the impact of trauma, I was also thinking, well, what is the impact of collective trauma then? What's the impact on these therapists who may resonate with the families they're working with through a collective or shared identity? And so these two quotes here, I think, describe that quite succinctly, where the first one, the therapist talks about feeling connected to the family, the parent Kairo in this instance, but realizing that it's in ways they didn't want to be connected, and that she could understand a lot of the pain that was in the parent and in the family and could feel it all. And the second quote, the different therapist was talking about a different family and recognizes that's my background. I grew up in a council estate. I feel like I can see why she's misunderstood, and that's the people I grew up with. And so actually, these two are two different responses. The first one, the therapist is not wanting to be connected and maybe wants to evacuate from these feelings. And then in the second one, this therapist was actually very mobilized and wanted to help because they could recognize a similarity. And so I noticed about 3 distinct responses from the impact of trauma. So after it was really overwhelming and they might have felt guilt, despair, really emotional. One of the responses that came out was mobilization, which you could liken to the anxiety responses fight. The other two were evacuation and paralysis, which you could liken to flight and freeze. So the first quote here, the therapist is talking about, they really felt they needed to do something. There was this sense of urgency. And actually in the case they were talking about, they weren't in a state of crisis, but something had got into this therapist where they really felt they needed to fight and hold on. The second one, the therapist refers to feeling really helpless and overwhelmed and really hopeless, and then remembering, no, I have to get back into the fight. And then the last one, the therapist is referring to this family of this case as recognizing they've been dealt too many bad cards and that it was the duty of the therapist to be tenacious and to hold on. And so the other responses, evacuation and paralysis, they sort of showed up at the same time together. And these are the terms that the therapists themselves used. That when we were talking in the interview, the therapist was asking, where's our anger? So I did pair interviews. So she's talking to the other therapist. That we can sit in here and talk about the school. So there was difficulties in the school. And they can feel it, but it doesn't quite get mobilized into anything. And then the second quote, and really the third quote, are both talking about feeling quite paralyzed by what was happening. So the second one, the therapist was paralyzed to share their thoughts with the family. And then the last one, it was just too painful. And that pain really just stopped them being able to do what they wanted to do. And so I'm wondering, as you're listening, if you can think of times where you felt these responses, where you might have seen something or heard something and felt really mobilized and wanted to do something, or actually it was too overwhelming, it was too uncomfortable, and you wanted to evacuate, or you actually didn't know what to do and felt quite paralyzed by it. And so really what I'm curious about is, what are the situations that can get into you and make you respond in a certain way? And so, which led me to think about two sort of terms, secondary traumatic stress and vicarious traumatization, as frameworks to think about the therapist responses. So Figley describes secondary traumatic stress as the natural consequent behaviors and emotions resulting from knowing about a traumatizing event experienced by a significant other, or distress resulting from helping someone who's been in a traumatized event. And McCann and Plowman describe vicarious traumatization as an indirect exposure to trauma through a first-hand account or narrative of a traumatic event by a practitioner who bears witness to the survivor's account of trauma. So both of these terms were coined in the 90s and really focusing specifically on the experiences of healthcare professionals. And since then, this term has widened to include other professionals, such as journalists, particularly those out in the field, archivists who have to collect or create really distressing historical events, also activists and campaigners. But I was thinking about, well, what are these responses? What do they have in common? They're not just unique to therapists or professionals. Mobilization, evacuation, paralysis, anxiety, fight, flight, freeze. Actually, everyone will, or most people, will have an experience of this. And so really what I was thinking about is this idea of a prolonged or repetitive exposure to something. And most people, maybe in this room, would be daily exposed to social media. And so I was thinking, how is social media used firstly? Some people might use it in a more light touch way, some people might use it more seriously, but really it's about connecting with others, about sharing your opinions, about storytelling, commenting on issues that are really important to you, raising awareness on things that are important to you. But actually, what is the impact then of repeated exposure to traumatic media? So some studies have suggested it can have traumatizing effects, particularly in areas of documented warfare on the average citizens in that country, but also in areas where there's been natural disaster and on an individual who's connected to that country but isn't in it, but is keeping up with what's happening via social media. Raise your hands if you have seen something distressing on social media, either a picture or a video. Yeah? Okay. I'd like you to keep your hands raised if it's been in this past week. So quite a few of you. Yeah. So currently there's little research which explores how social media can co-create trauma in those who have been formerly traumatized or those who have not been in that traumatic situation but feel as if they have done because they've witnessed it on social media. There's also very little research on the relationship between vicarious traumatization and social media, but we know that it can have a negative impact on those, particularly those who have a history of migration, displacement, discrimination, oppression, alienation, and more. However, it won't have an impact, it won't have an adverse impact on everybody. So then how can we reduce this impact? So some studies have suggested reducing your screen time on social media, minimizing distressing videos, turning the audio off or muting it on videos, or also adding content warnings. However, this does put the onus on the individual, and studies recognize that really pressure should be on social media companies to adopt more robust reporting measures. But this doesn't fully encapsulate how we as individuals use social media and also the different social media platforms and how they work. And so really, I'm not here to say don't use social media, but it's more about acknowledging how viewing distressing material makes you feel. Do you feel more mobilized by it? Do you feel that you're desensitized, you want to evacuate? Is it different material that you're seeing, that you have one or two of these feelings? And before I end, I'd like to sort of close on these last two questions, is how do we keep ourselves safe whilst wanting to stay connected with those around us online? And also, are there other ways that you can engage in activism or community building, which is outside of social media? Thank you.